Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to webinar week number 4 and day number 3. Absolutely delighted today to obviously have Mr. Mark Wilson in the co-pilot, and in the hot seat, Mr. Jason Kutney, who is a great friend of all of us at Beyond Pulse and is the ECNL Boys Commissioner. So we really thank Jason for being willing to share his time and insight and experience with everybody. We're going to dive, as we go through this conversation, into a concept that Jason's developed over what is in essence a lifetime in soccer and coaching. It's called Struggle, Survive and Thrive. And I'll let Jason, obviously, we'll get into that as we build through this. Obviously, his role with Boys ECNL is something that would be more familiar with many of you tuning in. But obviously, he is a wealth of knowledge to share as well from his time before that, and obviously the continuing education that he's now going on. So Jace, first and foremost, thank you for freeing up your time and spending your Wednesday afternoon with us. If you could, mate, please, just for the benefit of those listening, provide a little more of an insight into you, your career to this point, and then I'll start throwing some questions your way.
Yeah, no, first and foremost, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join. As you can see in Mark's background, there's a Manchester United jersey, and my background is my trophy case, as you can see from, yeah, exactly. So anyway, grew up in Jersey, so I have that in common with some of the STA folks, not you guys, but grew up in Jersey and ended up going to Pittsburgh for college. So Duquesne University is where I attended, spent 4 great years there. When we started, we were a very young team and very average and lost a lot of games because of young mistakes. And by the time I was a senior, we were top 15 in the country. And it was just really cool to be part of something like that and really grow through 4 years. Left college and went to play professionally for a few years and ended up having a 9-year career, mostly in the USL. Had a little bit of a stint within MLS and an opportunity, I should say, and kind of came crumbling down on me because of a coaching change at the time. And when I was licking my wounds from that, I went back to Pittsburgh and tried to figure out what was next in my life. And one thing kind of led to a next, and actually ended up getting involved with an indoor tennis and racquetball facility, which makes no sense to anybody watching this probably, but it was a big indoor facility that allowed me some time and space to run and stay fit in the cold winter months of Pittsburgh. And about 6 months into that, I ended up writing a business plan for the 2 owners of that facility, really showing them this is what I would do with this facility if I owned it, because tennis and racquetball were both very much aging out in the Pittsburgh market. So put that plan together, and surprisingly enough, they loved it and wanted to invest in it. And so the deal was I had to run it. It was a sweat equity position, which I ended up taking. It allowed me to maybe take soccer and put it on the back seat a little bit for me in my life, but start up on the business world side of things. And I really just grew into my passion for it. It was a small business. You did everything from, cleaning toilets and changing water tanks on the tennis courts to writing or watching turf installations and setting up batting cages and bi-leveling racquetball facilities and turning them into fitness centers, et cetera, et cetera. But it was cool because it created almost an indoor sports mecca for a soccer program, which was my dream. And so a year and a half into that, the Riverhounds in Pittsburgh, that franchise became available, and the ownership group decided to subscribe to soccer, and we purchased the club at that point in 2007 and built the Riverhounds Youth Academy that year. So that was really, for us, that was the basis of everything. Was we ran it out of the indoor facility. It really became a soccer facility more so than anything else. And probably 5 years later is when we started the plans for a soccer stadium in downtown Pittsburgh. And so Highmark Stadium became one of my projects from 2010 to 2014. And it was a very, very difficult time and difficult project, but it's a beautiful stadium. So after all that time, it was about 12 years all in with Riverhounds. And last year, I decided to join ECNL as the commissioner. So that's kind of a quick 3-minute tour, and there was a lot that took place within that 3 minutes, but it was an exciting time to mix soccer and business.
Perfect. And Jace, what I love with that is obviously the conversation that we're gonna dive deeper into is influenced by a lot of what you went through in, let's call it, the formative years and the years where you were working to find find an opportunity in business and in your professional development that's obviously led you to where you are today. But I think it's a really unique insight that you can offer as to obviously why you've come up with the ideology that you have. As we said at the start, people listening and people that see your name now at least will be more familiar with your role on the ECNL boys side of things. So if you could, before I start to kind of tackle a little bit about coaching and how it applies to soccer, how are you finding that? How's, obviously the excitement for the future and where things currently are?
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, the thing that I've always loved about the ECNL, I mean, obviously it started with the girls' side. For 3 years, Riverhounds were turned down by the ECNL. I still hold grudges, of course, but we eventually got in, and it was just a godsend for the club. It was one of those things that had changed the landscape of our club, and I was immediately dialed into everything that they were doing. I thought very highly of Christian and Doug and Jay Howell and all the different people involved. And, I thought Jen Winigal on the girls' side was doing just a tremendous job. And, when we first got Pittsburgh into the ECNL, I started really looking at the league and little by little offering maybe just some ideas on marketing and, things that maybe work, maybe don't. And I think just that the building up of that relationship over a year and a half, 2 years, just became positive. It was an idea sharing relationship more than anything else. And so when the opportunity presented itself for the commissioner role, I was at first not hesitant, but I was at first just kind of wondering, what do I want to do in my life and my own personal development? I felt like I had spent a lot of time with Pittsburgh, the staff in Pittsburgh. Many of these guys, Scott Gibson was my right-hand man for many years there, and he was certainly in his own development, he was in a position where he was more than ready and capable of taking on that academy and running it forward. And it was a good time for him to spread his wings. And so for me, I looked at it as a chance to take on a national project in some ways. I thought the ECNL on the boys side, if you kind of look 3 cars ahead on the highway and you start to see different brake lights, and some of those brake lights I thought were in different lanes, and it allowed the ECNL to really speed up in some ways with a few strategic changes. And so I was happy to sit down with Christian and Doug and talk about those changes and propose ideas. But since day one, getting involved last March, they have been very proactive in just allowing these ideas to kind of come to life and supporting them and putting their expertise into it. They're obviously wizards at what they do. So it's just been really progressive and positive, I would say. And I think the next 3 or 4 months is going to show, although this is a really difficult time for us all in the country and every business, but I think we'll be able to show our strength coming out of this.
Yeah, and I think for the benefit of people listening, we're obviously going to talk a little bit about the concept of what's next within the theory that you're going to kind of enlighten people by, and I think that is it's one of, from a personal perspective, it's one of the things that I've always admired about you, is that the proactive nature and the forward thinking approach that you bring to stuff. So just important for me to be able to frame everyday background or everyday life working experience and obviously the background that you bring to the rest of this conversation. So obviously we have spoken obviously a lot about this being a coaching education series, and your background as a youth and then professional player, and obviously now as a coach at some very high levels of youth soccer in the US. Could you share with me the 5 people that you consider to be the greatest influencers or people that captured your attention, the most memorable people that you worked with as a player or a coach, but in a coaching capacity, and what was it about them that has made them so memorable to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to start with my uncle, number one. As a young kid, I mean, my uncle was a guy that he played at Loyola in Maryland years ago when they were a very good collegiate team. Actually, I ended up losing in the Final Four to UVA when he was there. But he was a guy that came up in Jersey and he was playing against Tab Ramos and John Harkes and those guys up in Kearney quite a bit. And he was always just kind of he was my uncle. So he was a guy that we always looked up to. I was not, I was a typical American young athlete. I played every sport, but I think soccer was always one that, soccer and baseball really were kind of my 2 sports that I loved the most. But he was that guy that was like an inspiration. So he was family, but he was an uncle. So he wasn't on me every single day. I would see him every so often. And so just kind of I think sometimes with young kids and their parents, you blank out some of the things that they say over time. I hope my daughters aren't hearing me say this in the background, but when it's your uncle, or it's even sometimes your big brother, and I'll get to him next, but your uncle has this, he drops in, he's the guy that kind of brings exciting moments to your life, and he did that for me in soccer. I went down to watch him play at Loyola when I was a really little kid with my grandparents, and it was just kind of formative years for me to develop a passion and see how good he was. So I'll go to my brother next, because big brother, he was 3 years older than me. He kicked the crap out of me. I played up on his team as a youngster, and he was the kid that he was a bit of a bruiser on the field. And when guys would take shots at me because I was the young little one, he would be the equalizer that would come back and get them back. And so I think that kind of instilled just a hardness in me in my game that I really appreciated from him. Just that big brother mentality. So I think the family starts it. But in my young days, I played for Manny Shellshite as a young player in Jersey, and I can't, to be honest, I can't imagine any coach having had a bigger impact in my life. He was just so wise. He just kind of had a way about him. I think even when I was a young kid, he jumped into training sessions at times with ODP, whether it's Jersey ODP or even with regional teams and national pools, and it was just always there. Like everywhere I turned around, Manny was on the sideline, and it was kind of interesting to me. Like as a young kid, you don't get it. You don't know why he's always there. No matter what team I made and kept climbing the ladder, he was just always there. And then years down the line, you realize why, because every word he said to me was meaningful. And then we always use that words matter type of thing. Well, I don't know if Manny ever said a word that didn't mean something. And when Manny didn't say a word, it meant everything. You knew what it meant. So I do have some great Manny stories but we need more than a couple hours for that. Going forward, I think Duquesne University, Wade Jean was the coach when I got to Duquesne. Wade was it's kind of like Happy Gilmore, where he's a hockey player playing golf today. Wade was a hockey player, skier, coaching soccer, and he admitted that. But just an awesome coach. Like a coach of men, and he got the most out of everyone that he had on that team. We were a good team that won great games because of him, and he was just a great leader. And so for us, he brought a hockey mentality to it in Pittsburgh. That works really well. You'd have to be tough. You have to be bleeding. Otherwise, you didn't have a good training session in Pittsburgh. So Wade brought that to the equation. And I think the last piece of this for me, just a guy named Gene Klein. Gene's name has been in and around the soccer circles of this country forever for good reason. But he was an ODP coach for me when I was a little kid. He's from Western PA, but I met him through different ODP things overseas mostly. And then he was the first guy that we had hired for the Riverhounds to be our general manager in 2007. And he coached me then as a pro. So he coached me as a youth and he coached me as a pro, and just kind of just a really good guy. He knows the game so well, but he just knows humans, and he deals with humans really well. And I think that was one of the more profound things about my, a takeaway from Gene is just, I think more and more, and we'll talk about this with Struggle, Survive, Thrive, it's more about managing and leading humans than it is coaching players. And I think that was probably my biggest takeaway with Gene. I can't count, yeah, but I think that was 5.
That was 5, mate. You nailed it. And again, I know obviously where the direction of this conversation is going, but I think there's it's always intriguing to me to hear about the influences or the things that stick out. So obviously you referenced the fact that playing up with your brothers and being used to struggling, being used to it being tough. Like it wasn't easy. Pittsburgh is, it is maybe more blue collar and, hard nosed than some other places. And, Kearney similarly. So there's got to be a resilience that you develop. And I think obviously you've referenced the human connection piece and understanding how all of this layers in is obviously where we're going to go with the conversation. So if you could now, Jace, we've obviously titled this Struggle, Survive and Thrive, and provide the listeners with a little bit of an insight into, what it is, and then we'll kind of where it's come from, and then we'll unpack it as we move forward.
Yeah, so Struggle, Survive, Thrive is something that to be honest, I developed that idea, and I didn't know it was really an idea I was developing at the time, but I developed it through my first child, I should say, especially. So when when you're a young guy and you're in soccer, like everyone that probably is listening and all the coaches, you spend so much time at the office or on the field and so little time with your family. And that's just so unfair to our better halves. But then when you have a child, it changes things, you know, and it shouldn't take that child's arrival to change that, but it oftentimes does. And it's a wake up call for us. And for me, it was a wake up call in the sense that I needed to spend more time with my family, but I needed to study how to spend that time with my family, you know, and with my daughter, she's 5 now. I'm blessed to have two. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. But when my 5-year-old was, you know, young, it was just one of those things where you're trying to understand how to, you know, help, how to be a parent, you know, how to lead, how to teach, and you don't know the answers, and they're not going to give you the answers, and you have to struggle your way into figuring out what those answers are. But you know, I started thinking about this over time as it relates to employees and soccer players, because you know, when you, for instance, try to teach a baby to walk, or even before that, to roll over from belly to back or back to belly, you have to kind of lead. You know, you have to lead. You have to design with your better half. You have to design a plan, you know, a session plan, if you will, as to how they're going to do it, how they're going to accomplish it. You know, they're going to struggle because they don't know what they're doing yet. You know, they haven't experienced this yet before, and so everything is so brand new with a baby. But laying out those steps to figure out how to relate first and foremost to that baby, so that they develop a trusting relationship, because you know they don't know who you are yet, and you have to build that trust in a unique way. But then how to guide them, how to set clear plans for what they're trying to accomplish, how to nudge them along, guide them along, and eventually let them struggle a bit. And it's in that struggle, I think it's somewhere right within that struggle, where you become a leader. You know, or at least you understand what a leader is and what a leader needs to be. And so for me, I said, okay, well, now when I take that to the soccer world or to business with employees, it's good and it's healthy to set up opportunities for people to struggle, but you have to help them to get to a point where they can survive, you know, where they can make it, where they can do that. And really where that comes in is praise and, you know, and compassion and passion. And those are things that I didn't do a great job of when I was younger. When I was 23 and running a business that had, you know, many employees, and I was younger than a lot of them, I wasn't good at that, and I struggled with that. And as a young coach, I struggled with that because I came out of my playing days and everything was just hard. You know, be tougher. If you can't put up with this, if you can't deal with this, then you're soft, you're weak. You need to move out of the way. And after I had a child, I realized there's no bad teams. There's just bad leaders. You know, and if that person doesn't get it, it's because you're not helping them get it. You're not setting up the resources that they need to get it. And with my baby and my daughter, I realized that if she was going to learn to walk, I was going to have to let her struggle. I was going to have to let her fail. She was going to have to fall down. Babies learn to walk by falling down. The more they fall down, the easier it is, because that means they're trying to get it. And it was like an epiphany, you know, like, why am I not doing this with employees? Why am I, when they're starting to get something, why am I not commending them? Why am I not praising them? And it was because it was always, what's next? You know, okay, we just accomplished a job. What's next? We just accomplished a job. What's next? We just won this game. What's the next event we're going to? And very few times in my career did I stop to say, you guys did a great job. You know, you're awesome. That's so good, because that positive reinforcement is how you get from survive to thrive. You know, and that's when people start to feel that wind behind them, pushing them in a positive direction. And it's because, again, we're leading humans, we're not coaching players. When you make it about human beings, and you believe that you're working with those lives, it becomes real. And so once you get someone to that thrive mode, they're flying, they're doing a great job. You have to, in order for them to keep growing, you have to put them into the next moment of struggle. You know, and it's got to be a step forward. You can't fall them backwards. But to me, that's struggle, survive, thrive, and I've related it then to business and to sport. But again, I wish I had that knowledge that I developed through my baby. I wish I had that when I was 23, 24, 25, and I was failing as a leader at that time.
So with that said, Jace, if we could, obviously there's so many different tangents that we can go on around how you can utilize and apply that kind of concept in the soccer space. Obviously the line is the majority of coaches, they're working on the ground with their players. Some will be running clubs for sure. But can you provide just, again, examples of what it might look like? You know, I think sometimes struggling is is maybe clear, but you know, how do you intentionally create sessions or activities that can be the focus, that struggle is the focus of the session, you know, and what comfort and trust does it take in you as a coach to know that this is A, beneficial, and B, that, you know, I'm not going to have to stop in and fix every problem that I see, and that kind of organized chaos is okay, and you know, we can scaffold information. And like, can you talk to a little bit about the application of the idea in a practice session?
Yeah, no, I think the easiest way to answer that is that, you know, I started looking at soccer coaching as basically leading individual players. And that was a change for me. Prior to that was really macro focused and very rarely micro. And so I would think if the team wasn't successful, it's because of something was wrong with that team. I wasn't doing something with that team. I didn't break it down into parts and say, well, you know, there's a few broken parts within this team, and I need to hold myself accountable for those broken parts and fix those. Because look, a car with 3.5 tires, right? So, you know, I had to stop looking at the car. I had to look at the tires. I had to kind of start thinking about how am I going to really focus this in on individual players. So, you know, think about, I'll give you one example of a leadership issue. You know, so I had coached a team a few years ago where there was a very vocal player on the field, excellent player. I mean, one of the best players that I'd been coaching. And she'll go on and do really well in the college game and everything else, but she was a vocal leader. And when people came to watch her in a moments game, you know, they would say, wow, you know, what a leader, what a leader. She always vocal, always barking at players around her and giving instruction out and everything else. But what no one else saw, and what I started to realize, was that that bark over time started to just kind of drain everyone else on the team. And so it was just eventually that bark bite syndrome. You're going to get bitten if you keep barking and barking and barking. And some of those teammates of hers basically started to shut her out and stop listening. And so I sat down with her and I gave her the soak sponge analogy. And the soak sponge analogy is, it goes that if you take a sponge and you pour water on it, its job is to soak up that water, right? But eventually it becomes soaked. And if you pour more water on that sponge, it's just going to fall off. It's not going to get absorbed anymore. And you have to wring out the sponge. And the way you wring out the sponge is by, you know, ... In this case, it was by giving praise to players around her. You know, she was very quick to jump on players when they made mistakes and instruct them in ways that were, you know, you're not doing this and you're supposed to be doing that. But when they did things, they didn't get that recognition. They didn't feel that praise. And again, I took that back to myself and I'm like, wow, this is what I struggled with. You know, I was, as a manager, as a young leader, I was a barker too. And I'm sure there was employees that wanted to bite my head off, but I didn't take the time to praise them. And so, you know, setting up training sessions that help that player tally almost how many good positive comments come out of your mouth versus how many bad ones. You know, and when I say bad, I mean instructional, but instructional over time can start to feel bad, right? And so having players like that think about things like that I as a coach had to become aware of those things and start tallying those so that I could show her midway through a training session, and then midway through a game, you know, you had 15 sharp comments to teammates, you had 2 positive reinforcement comments. Can we rate, you know, can you change that a little bit and see what the net effect will be with your teammates? And then just the same with the soccer, you know, the more soccer side of things. When you go into, we all as coaches have, in my view, you know, we all have our staple exercises that we like to go back to. And I use the training wheels analogy. You know, once someone learns how to ride a bike, they don't oftentimes go back and put training wheels on. And so to recycle exercises over and over and over again without any thought of how is this going to help the team is basically just putting training wheels on. They're just going through the motions. And so when you take a possession game where there's 3 teams, 2 on the inside, 1 on the out, and you have those as bumpers, you know, just taking things like, okay, break it into quadrants. When you use an outside player, that outside player has to re-enter the ball into a new quadrant. Or the game is inside out versus outside in, meaning, you know, you're either rewarded for using outside players to find a third man running, or you're punished for using outside players so that you focus everything inside the lines of the field. But just, you know, putting players in uncomfortable situations that make their brain twist in a new way will oftentimes create a struggle, and the struggle will be felt differently by different players because they're all individual players. And, you know, the A level players are going to feel differently than the B's and the C's, but every team we all coach always has A's, B's, and C's no matter the level.
So
jump in here? I love the concept, firstly, Jason, and it got me thinking when you first shared the snapshot of what this is. It got me thinking about how this applies to coaching, and I'm going to stay fixated in a granular way on the struggle piece for coaches. So from a practical application, when you think about identifying struggle, so you're a TD, you're a DOC, you've got to identify or create moments where coaches are going to struggle. But first, can you identify where somebody's struggling? In terms of the psychological struggle coaches go through, that can be masked by bravado, by ego. You know, you don't know what you don't know, so you block people out, and you may appear confident, and sometimes things coming out of your mouth can appear confident to somebody who doesn't know really or have a depth of understanding of the game. First, how do you identify the intangibles, and what mechanisms do you put in place for that? And second, what are the measurables for when you identify the start of struggle, the middle of struggle, the end of struggle, and now it becomes survive? When do you recognize that, and from a coaching perspective, when somebody's ready to come out of that?
I think those are probably the hardest questions to answer, but they're the best questions to ask, right? And so I just go back. For me, it has always been about taking the time to understand the people that you're leading, that you're in charge of, because these, you know, oftentimes as coaches of teams, we want to win, you know, and so the measurable that everyone thinks about is wins and losses. Well, you know, that's a dangerous thing, right? Versus if you look at it and you say, okay, I started with 18 players this season as a coach and I ended with 22, or I retained 95% of those players into the following year. Maybe some of those players drop to a different level within the club, but they stay, and they stay because of that guidance and that leadership, or you gain players on the team because of that guidance and leadership. And I think it applies to your question. You know, when you look at the challenges or the struggles, every player on your team, or every player that, or every employee that you manage, or whatever, every human being has their own challenges, and you don't know many of those challenges. You don't know when these players go home to their households. You don't know what they're living in, the environment they're in. You don't know some of the stresses they're dealing with. You know, it could be broken homes, divorces. It could be, you know, there's a multitude of things that you don't know, and you have to try to take the time to understand as much as you can those things and getting to know those people, because that's where the trust builds up, right? Your baby is around you all the time, and you're feeding them and changing diapers and everything else. So, you know, in some ways you're a good function for them at first, and then all of a sudden they start to develop a rapport with you, and they laugh and they smile, and then it becomes real. Well, with players that you're coaching at these teenage years, or, you know, youth 8 years, they have to develop that trust too. And the only way they're going to develop the trust is if they believe that you genuinely care about their lives. And so when you think about it from that standpoint, the challenges become personal, and you understand.
Yeah, we lost you maybe 20 seconds ago when you were
that was the most profound thing you would have ever heard too. That was the best part.
I was going to go next, Jace, into obviously that it's a great question from Willow from a coaching perspective, as in when you're dealing with coaches. But when you are a coach of players, what you're speaking about to me lends itself to concepts of flow, and like finding the stretch zone for people and keeping them kind of on the brink of being capable of completing a task and not quite there, and individualization or differentiation of sessions within sessions. So my question to you would be around, if you have intentionally tried to create struggle for somebody, how important is it to know what positively completing that challenge looks like? And then B, how important is it to know where to go next? Because I'm assuming it's a process to go from where you are to a place of heightened performance or skill acquisition. So how, as a coach, do you try to consciously and deliberately map out what that journey might look like for somebody?
I think the initial phase of that is sitting down with the player and really having an honest discussion. Very often coaches shy away from the honest discussion and the harsh reality. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stockdale paradox, but I'm a Jim Collins Good to Great guy, and I think it's one of the best books I've ever read. But the Stockdale paradox is kind of it's when, you know, realism and it's basically you have to adjust for the fact that you have faith that you're going to be successful in a mission, but you're going to deal in the harsh realities. And without those two things, it's really impossible to be successful. So, Jim talks about it from a standpoint of kind of, how you balance realism and optimism, because we want to be optimistic, we want to be positive, but we got to be real, and as coaches, we don't want to gloss over things with players. So if there's a player that's on the bottom rung or in the middle rung or whatever of a team, being honest with them and telling them where they are is important, so that they understand where you see them and where you view them. But then you have to come back with, okay, here's where we're going to help you climb that ladder to a higher rung, whether that's 1 rung or 10 rungs. You got to help them. That's on you as a coach. And so when you accept someone on your team, you accept that responsibility, that accountability is on you. And I think from when you go through the journey with that player, the ability of a player to see themselves and envision themselves at a higher level in the game is key, but they're only going to see it if they believe that you see it in them. And I know a lot of this is more the mental side, but that's kind of where I have always been more, I think, effective as a coach than anything else. I've said it from day one years ago. I told everybody I believe I'm an excellent trainer, I'm a good coach, and I'm an aspiring leader. And so I'm a better trainer than I'm a coach, but I'm trying to be the best leader possible. And that's where I say aspiring, because I'm getting better at this every year. And from a coaching development standpoint, when I look at a young player who's a central midfielder who loves to be on the ball, and we can all, obviously, if they're a player that loves to dance on the ball and dribble, you can always limit their touches in games or in sessions, right? But in many times I would add more touches to them. I would force them to take more touches. And it was just, I wouldn't tell other people, other teammates, that I was doing that for that player, but I would say, look, I want you, every time you get on the ball, I want you to have a minimum of 6 touches in this play. And it would just force them out of, it made them think about their touches, because prior to that point, they just thought about being on the ball, and they loved being on the ball. And then when they had to start counting touches, before you knew it, they were like, wow, I didn't realize I took 12 touches before I released the ball. And again, just making them aware of it without saying, what are you doing? You shouldn't be, because I love dribblers. You know what I mean? Like I'm the coach that never does a 1 or 2 touch game. I love players playing on the ball and being on the ball and being comfortable. So doing little things like that, again, I use that twist the brain approach, but just making them think a little bit differently. It's not anything that they're not accustomed to, taking 12 touches. They may take 12 touches all the time, but now that you're forcing them to take a minimum of 6 or minimum of 8, all of a sudden their teammates might get mad at them, because again, they're always, no matter what, they're always taking 8 touches. They don't know why, so they're going to start barking at that player, and that player's going to start to feel it a little bit. But putting them into just a situation that's a little bit different, that makes them think about what they're doing. Awareness is one of the most potent weapons of any human being. If you're aware of what you're doing, if you're aware of the application of what you're doing, if you're aware of the impact of what you're doing and aware of your surroundings, you are a more successful human being typically. So making players aware and thinking about those things when they traditionally don't, because the automatic response is, you have to play 1 touch. What are you doing? You have to play fewer touches, less touches, less touches. We as coaches often, we love to say, keep it all the time. Keep it. But are you as a coach telling them how to keep it? Are you teaching them? Are you giving them the skills to keep the ball? Are they good enough to keep the ball? Like things like that. There's ways that you can dive deeper into those concepts. But again, you have to make the players aware of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and then help them understand that it's okay they're doing it, but maybe there's some different things that they can do with it.
For sure. And it sounded for a second like you were almost apologetic about the fact that it's psychologically oriented. And all I was going to say is the crux of this whole month has been that whether you're a coach educator, a player, it's so many of the conversations have come back to the psychosocial piece of either the relationship formation, coach-athlete relationship, individual ability to be resilient, to solve problems. Like it's a huge corner of it, and it's kind of nice for me from a very biased and selfish perspective to unintentionally to have that ideology come out in a lot of the conversations that we have. So again, for the benefit of people listening that perhaps maybe hadn't considered the emphasis and the importance of it, those that have obviously been with us through this journey, I'm hoping it's starting to become pretty apparent. Jace, talk to me now, if you could, about so you've set up struggle, they're into survive, and then the transition to thriving. I think obviously the easiest way of recognizing this or acting upon this in our industry is probably to have people then train or play up, to continue to keep them in that stretch zone, in that, in essence, struggle or survive mentality. But talk to me about the importance of managing them through that process. I think the analogy you gave is, we don't want them to go up and then to regress, right? And to kind of, not be ready, again, perhaps psychologically, not be ready emotionally, want to hide, want to revert back, and actually that experience being more damaging than positively impactful. So obviously, as we come out of this, can you kind of talk to how those types of processes will be managed?
Yeah, I think the planning of it's just like when we use the reference with babies walking. There's a plan in place, or you're not going to have them walk on glass. You're going to have them walk on a nice thick carpet, and the less sharp objects around them, the better. Well, you have to do the same planning when you put a player up. I think the most obvious way that we as coaches believe that we're all Pep Guardiola if we push a young player up, and this is what they do in Germany, and we love those types of things, because when you push the best 05 up to play with the 04s or train with the 04s, it seems like we stick our chest out a little bit, that we did right by the game. And yeah, there's many benefits to it, but you have to manage the psychosocial piece of that more than you have to manage the soccer side of that. And so when that player goes up and trains with the older players, how are the older players going to look at that player? Are they going to be welcoming to this kid? No, they have a young kid coming in that's trying to take maybe their spot. How are the parents of the players on that team going to view a youngster coming up? How are the parents of the 05 players, the other kids that didn't get selected to play up, how are they going to view that kid? So now all of a sudden that kid is in a really precarious situation where he needs to be really, really good. He needs to be successful on the field. So if he goes in with the 04s and he doesn't have the greatest session, that's to be expected. Right? That you're putting him in a moment to struggle. You have to let him struggle. You have to let him struggle through that moment, because eventually he may survive, and who knows, he may be better than the 04s and be needing to train up the 03s at some point. But the reality is, you put him into a new situation, you put that challenge upon that player. From a soccer standpoint, you also have to acknowledge that there's a psychosocial piece to this, because when that player, if that player feels threatened and makes a few mistakes, and the 04s get on him or her, and they have to drop back down to the 05s, do they look at that as a drop? Now they're back with their of-age team. Is that a drop? Are they perceiving that as a regression in their own development? And then how do those 05s treat that player? Are they welcoming back that player, or are they giving him, some crap for going up and playing with the 04s, and you're the special one, and all these little comments that start to build up. So what you don't want is that player to then choose to be average on the 05s, so that he doesn't or she doesn't get the opportunity to go up, because they might look at that opportunity as a stress point in their life. So, I think it's always the most obvious way that we can make a player struggle, is when you think about the A players on a team. It's easy to think about the best players on a team and how to make them struggle. But really the key question is, do you think about the B level players and the C level players? The C level players and the A level players stand out one way or the other, right? They stand out in a positive or a negative way. So they're easy. They're the outliers. We see them. Oftentimes as coaches, we go help the C's by doing extra training sessions with them, or, just spending a little bit more time. But what happens to the B players that are stuck in this survive mode? Because over time, you just survive, and then die. So as a soccer player, if you're in that middle, if you're a B level player on a team, what's helping you get to the A side? What's the end goal for you? And oftentimes we don't know that if we don't know the players.
I think that's a really, I love where we're going with this. The survive piece is critically important, again, from a planning perspective, of recognizing if a player's been in this survive phase for too long, what are the indicators that they've been in there for too long? How do I create challenges for my A, B, and C level players in one practice? And I think if you plan and prepare and self-reflect regularly on your practices, you should be able to create opportunities for all of your players to have moments of struggle. Get them up into that survive stage, and for the players that are surviving, get them to thrive. I think if we're creative enough and we think long and hard about it and really plan and prepare properly, self-reflect on things that didn't go so well in a practice, and really self-analyze and be critical. And I think it is possible to fit all three of those things, those elements, into one practice design. Managing it, again, you need skill set to do that, and that's another coach development piece. But I think everything that you're saying with these three words attached, you could almost have that as your theme for a month and just build these sessions around it. No, it's fascinating.
Okay, I'm going to ask, and I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here, because I equally, obviously, I believe wholeheartedly in what you're saying, but I want to talk to the practical application of it, and taking the same concepts and saying, okay, if we want to do that, then some things that we might have to do is create a culture that is accepting of and praising of players that are progressing, right? And a team culture where they see that as one of their own being applauded, and you've created basically a community that is supportive of one another and not envious of one another, right? I think we spoke last week of looking sideways for inspiration, not looking sideways for envy. So how easy is it to do that, and what types of advice would you have for coaches to create the type of culture in their team and organization where the players wouldn't want to regress and wouldn't choose to be average? So that's question one. Question two is, within the same session, to individualize and differentiate, as we spoke about at the start, to make sure that you're appropriately catering to the bottom end of a group. Maybe the concept of ability-based coaching has to be, or ability-based grouping has to be present. Maybe it's a rondo in a box that's 4 by 4 yards wider than the top group, right? So we're tweaking some of the environmental constraint on the session to afford them the opportunity to have more success. But from the outside, it's evidently very different. So again, how do you build relationships or an understanding from perhaps a parent's perspective, and then the comfort from a player's perspective that I'm going to do what I genuinely believe is best for you. And again, don't look sideways and be envious, look sideways for inspiration of where you want to go. And obviously the kind of broader piece of that is, from a club perspective or a coaching perspective, how do you portray that message to parents? So I know there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I love the idea and I believe in the idea, but I'm also very aware that in order to do it successfully, you're probably going to have to struggle. You're probably going to have to survive for a bit before you can actually thrive, right, in the formation of any kind of team culture and process. So if you could.
Yeah, no, so I mean, I guess the first thing to really say, I think from a culture standpoint, and I've experienced this in business and soccer for sure, is that the culture, there needs to be more telling, less yelling, right? And that goes for players and coaches and bosses and everything else. But we live because of social media in many respects, we live in an environment that is so ready to pounce on something at all times, ready to show the negative side of something at all times, that it becomes a blame game culture, you know, and that starts from the top in this country. And I'm not a political person, but the blame game, it's dripping through this country at a rapid pace right now. We're always willing to blame someone else for what's wrong at all times. And so when you have a culture like that in the soccer field, you know, if the coach is always yelling and very rarely telling, you know, telling is a big difference. Telling is where you're telling somebody what they did right, what they did wrong, and you're helping them through it. Yelling is just yelling, right? Firemen don't yell at a fire, they pour water on it, right? So are you pouring water on issues in your own team? And then that goes down to your players. If you are constantly yelling, then you are creating a culture where your teammates are yelling at each other in order to tell them a message. They're not telling them a message, they're yelling them a message. And that culture, for me, is one of the hardest things to counteract when it's created. But it's created by the coach. Again, you know, no bad teams, just bad leaders. Leaders create that culture. So changing that and making it a positive situation for the players on the field, the reason I bring it up is I think it's paramount to having any positive dialogue or growth strategy is to get people to listen to each other. You know, get people to listen to the coach and then get the players on the field to listen to each other. You know, I've done a lot of research over the last few years on level 5 leadership and, you know, the level 1 all the way up through level 5. And, you level 1 is that individual that can work on individual tasks. Level 2, they start to understand how to work with maybe one other person. Level 3, they start to kind of, bring a group together. But level 4 and level 5 is where you have to have people bought into a message. And, the difference between level 4 and level 5 is level 4, you're helping people buy into a message and attack it. But level 5, if you're a level 5 leader, you can walk away from your team and that team would still act in the same way as if you were there. And little things like I did this with one of my teams a few years. I've only had probably a couple of teams that I thought were at this level that I've coached over however many years, but there was one team where it was a 7 o'clock training session. I showed up at 7, but I didn't go out on the field. I just went up it was in our stadium in Pittsburgh, and they have kind of the suite level that you can look over the field. And I just sat up there and I watched just to see what would happen at 7, 7:01, 7:02. Would they get on with the session? Because then 10 minutes in, most teams are, I think, competent enough to say, okay, let's get a warm up and then maybe do some 5v2s waiting for the coach to come out. But what happens at 7:35? What happens at 8? What are they doing at that time? Because if they've basically shut it down and they're just like, well, the coach isn't here, then you are failing as a leader, right? And I had one, really, well, two teams I did this with. One team was, 7:45, 8 o'clock, they were flying. In a full session, they just held each other accountable. They were running a training session without me there. The other team, 7:15 rolls around and they're looking at each other like, well, what should we do? Should we leave? The parents are coming out onto the field, like they're talking to their parents. And I realized that I just needed to help them mature as a team and understand, what it was their team. It wasn't my team, right? And so, the reason I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think the questions you asked were very, poignant and relevant to the game, but I don't see any way to really address issues within a team if that team is blaming each other or yelling at each other or envious of each other. You have to get them to pull in the same direction. And the only way you can do that is if you have a positive culture where you are holding yourself fully accountable to every issue that pops up. Your keeper plays the ball out of the back, goes to the striker for the other team, they tuck it away, you're down 1-0 right away. Well, whose fault is it? You are creating a culture where you want your keeper to play out of the back. So if you snap on your keeper at that point and you yell at them versus waiting and telling them, okay, maybe in this situation I would have looked maybe to break a line there. It's okay to every once in a while to break a line. You have to accept that failure as your own so that the team feels like it's okay to make more mistakes. You have to create a culture where it's okay for the baby to fall down and get back up and keep trying to walk. And if you stop them from falling down by catching them all the time, or if you yell at them when they fall down, no one would yell at their baby for when they're learning to walk when they fall down, right? But that's what we do as coaches. We wait for moments where our kids on the field fall down and we yell at them. Well, what are they going to do next time?
How important is it in the whole process to have check-ins or maybe preface? And again, I'm going to go just to the fact that the majority of people will deal with younger players, and the culture that you're describing is one that I think would be one that we'd love to see, right? And we'd love to have the capacity and the capability to build. But how important is it to explain your why sometimes to them, right? So they know that, because I'm going to speak from personal experience. Sometimes they're like, look, I'll be unapologetic about the struggle and putting you in situations that stretch you for these reasons, right? And it's not that we're not here to pick you back up, but we'll be doing a disservice if we left it comfortable and easy and everything like that. So they need to understand that where we're coming from is a place of, support and obviously from growth, and we're coaching them in a way that we hope will allow them to fulfill their potential. But the same goes to their parents, right? So I'm sure that, would you advise, hey, by the way, because I think it goes to broader communication to be able to build and establish that culture where you can have the autonomy to experiment in the way that you're kind of describing. So what would the recommendation be for engaging with parents in this to help them understand why you're doing what you're doing? And even if they don't fully want to support it, they at least understand what's happening, so that the session, if you do choose to not, to stand 100 yards away and not coach, that obviously people aren't, being hung, drawn and quartered for not being at a practice session, just in that type of example?
I was always, to a fault, I was always way more communicative with parents than most around me, you know, and I, when a parent would ask me a question, I'm naturally a deep thinker. Like I think and I write, and you know, so anyone that's ever worked for me or played for me knows that they'll get some novels of emails every once in a while that really, you know, go in depth in things. And yeah, you just gotta. That's me, you know. I'm so, like I tell people, I'm sorry, that's me. If you're gonna ask me a question, you're gonna get a pretty long answer sometimes. You know, if it demands a long answer. I very rarely get to a yes or no when it comes to deep thinking topics, when it comes to people, you know, because there's so many variables. So I was always a huge believer in over communicating to parents and just hitting them with so much information that they can see that I'm thinking from all these different angles because I care. You know, and if a parent believes that you truly care about their kid, they will talk to you in a different way. They will address issues with you in a different manner than they would otherwise. And it can't be a cheap, you know, it just can't be a cheap comment that you give them about their child. It has to be thought out. If they're an A, B, or C level player, it's just got to be so, you have to be so invested in their child because, you know, now I'm a parent, right? If someone is invested in my child and is truly caring about my child, then that means something to me, right? Like that person, then I don't know what that person does in their life outside of that, you know, whether it's soccer or gymnastics or whatever my daughter is doing, like, but it means something to me that they're investing in my child. And I look at that the same way as, you know, as people or employees or players now, that if you over communicate with the parents and give them a real understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that their child will struggle, and that's a key thing. Like you have to be clear with them that you are intentionally sometimes helping their child struggle, but you're helping them fall forward as opposed to backwards. I think that all comes down, the success of that all comes down to how much that parent believes that you are being real versus feeding them BS. And parents can sniff that out real quick.
Yeah, no, thank you, mate. That's, again, I just think that side of this is going to be, in my opinion, it's going to allow the coaches to, if they listen to this and like, wow, that's a really cool idea, and yeah, I would really like to try that. I think it's just understanding that part of it is just so essential. And I think the fact that you said, you know, you're almost apologetic about it, I'm kind of always of the opinion that I would rather over communicate than under communicate, from a perspective of trying to inform them of hey, this is ultimately our why. So I don't want, it's expectation management, and I don't want you trying to assume and guess, because then it could end in disaster for everybody. Right. So, you know, so thank you for that. Jay, I don't know if there's anything specifically that you feel, from either an application perspective or a, you know, hey, I really wanted to touch upon this element of the theory and how coaches could implement it. I don't know if there's something that you feel is missed. I certainly am very appreciative, and again have a couple of pages of notes of different ways of applying the ideas and understanding it more. Willow, I don't know if we want to open it to the audience or if there's something specific that you guys want to add before we do that.
I've got one selfishly from an elite youth kind of pathway and perspective. There are instances where, and I think you'll probably agree with this, Jason, I don't know, players can go from thrive to thrive to thrive to thrive, and they don't hit a roadblock until they're in a first team somewhere. So is there something unique about that pathway and process? Because I've been around players that no matter what they did, they were always on this upward curve, and it was thrive just consistently, and then you're at the top. That's the first point of struggle. So if you've got a player in that environment and you've got this concept in place, I can imagine it not being the most difficult thing to manage within a group, but how in that sense would the concept apply to that 1% or less than 1% of player that doesn't need to struggle and survive to thrive and just keeps thriving no matter what environment you throw him in? Is there a different model to that or plan in place to support that growth, that continued growth, or does he just do what he wants anyway because he's on that pathway? He's unique, or she's unique.
It's hard, right? I mean, because the special case players are always the ones that they're the golden children, you know. So they're the ones that no club wants to lose, because God forbid they go to another club, then 7 or 8 other players are going to go, and people are going to ask questions, and you know, there a lot of times those are the players that other clubs offer free scholarships to, and you know, they're the ones that you wine and dine, and they experience that wining and dining for so many years that eventually when hardship faces them or hits them for the first time, it puts them backwards, you know. And that's where the ability to fall forward multiple times will only help that, because if you fall backwards, and if you fall backwards for the first time, it could be bad, right? And I'm happy, you know, my childhood and where I grew up and dealing with some of the, you know, the hardships there, and just kind of going through the learning curve that I did, which was a very steep one when I started with the indoor facility and then the River Hounds as a young individual that wasn't ready to lead people. I learned the hard way so many times. And when we were building the stadium, you know, one advisor, one good friend of mine said the stadium's going to die 7 times before it ever has a chance of surviving. And I didn't know what he meant. And the first time it died, because it did die, it died more than 7 times. But the first time it died, I died. You know, my world collapsed, because I was working like everyone else that was involved in the project, 20 hours a day, you know, 7 days a week, probably 8 days a week at that point. But it was miserable when it died. And that failure, I really feel like the only reason I was in a position mentally to kind of eventually dust myself off was because I had failed prior to that point. You know, I failed so many times in different things, but when you're an idea guy and you're kind of relentless about pursuing goals, you're gonna fail, you know, and you have to, as a coach and as a leader of humans, again, I keep going back to leader of humans as opposed to coach of players, but if you have a human on your team that is like that is always getting the easy way, you know, and don't get me wrong, some of those players work very hard, and it just continues to seem easy. So they're not choosing necessarily to avoid it, but you have to create challenge for them. I had one player a few years ago that was a very good player who just didn't come out of his shell. You know, he was just kind of a player that didn't come out of his shell at all. And you had to find different ways in the social realm outside of the lines of the field to help that player come out of his shell. You know, like just think of challenging situations that you can put that individual in from a social standpoint around their peers that would force them out of their comfort zone. If they have a good voice and they never share it, and you force them to sing in front of their teammates, you know, like things like that, where that's not easy. That is not easy, you know, and eventually that, you know, initially those teammates may be laughing and giggling, like, what is going on with this kid? But if the kid's a really good singer, then eventually all those kids are gonna be like, well, wish I could sing like that. Like deep down, they're gonna leave that practice, but man, I wish I had that voice. And you know, there's things off the field that you can help players struggle with that will relate to them on the field eventually.
Yeah, it's a very cool idea. How important do you think, we spoke at the end, I think offline yesterday, Mark, we started to speak about unconscious consciousness, and you know, Jace, we obviously have a personal relationship where I know the types of messages you give to the players, and this has been an insight into it, certainly from, you know, the way that you go about coaching. But we've kind of spoken quite a lot about this, and you know, taglines, and you know, even what you said about falling forward. I'm sure that word and phrase has been used in, you know, team meetings or to coach children. It's not so. Even if the person isn't going through it in that moment, how important is it that there's process-oriented language and feedback being given that obviously relate to overcoming this kind of overcoming a struggle and being resilient and kind of being brave, so that when they get into it, even if they haven't had to experience it prior to that point in a soccer specific way, the concept of what you're asking them to do is familiar. Even if it is kind of more on an unconsciously conscious level.
I think, well, yeah, that's great. I mean, it's repetition of any, you know, we talk so much about repetition when it comes to technical skill development. Well, it's repetition of thought as well, you know, because the more that you say things and reinforce things in a positive way, the more you're players will take that on and start breathing life into it themselves. Like I've always said, I'm like I said earlier, I'm a good coach. I'm not a great coach by any means. I've been out coached many times over. But what I tried to do is just kind of think about the people that I was coaching, think about what makes them tick. And, I think when you think on that level, it just helps you set goals in a different way. The goals for me, like I said earlier, were always gaining more players over the course of a year. That's extra baggage in some ways that you have to deal with as a coach. There's more players, there's more, you have to worry about playing time and issues like that. But it's just, for me, that's what worked. That was my metric of how to develop, because I was developing a positive environment in which other people heard so many great things about that they wanted to be a part of. And when you're in that positive environment, I feel like eventually people push themselves higher and higher on their own. And I did an exercise years ago, and I started years ago, and I kept doing it each year with teams that I coach, where I would find, in my own way, I would have, here's my A players, my B players, my C players. I would take the group and I would split them into 3 teams. And the only way I would really do this, I would initially take an A player, a B player, C player, put them on team A, B, and C, team B. So you have 9 players, but then those 3 players, you then had them form teams, right? So you had them kind of draft the rest of the team. And the team, this had nothing to do with training or playing. It was building a training session. So you would have an A, a B, and a C player as captains together, because oftentimes the A's, when you say, okay, let's split into 3 teams of 7, all your A's go together with maybe a B or 2 here. All the C's go together, and then the B's are left like, I'd love to be with the A's, but I'm not sure. It looks like I'm stuck with the C's today. Like, you have that culture. And so what I did was just take an A, a B, and a C together on purpose, and then had those 3 people and those 3 people and those 3 people form teams. And then basically they had to create a training session that I was going to participate in as a player. They were going to run it, but those 3 teams had to communicate internally to build their session. So team A had to do the first phase of the session. Team B did a second phase. Team 3 did the third phase, the big field. But they had to communicate within to build their portion, and then they had to communicate across with the other 2 teams to build a full training session. And then the day arrived to actually run the session, and I sat back and was just wondering who's going to run it. Who's going to step up, and is it going to be one of the 3 people or someone else? And to me, psychologically, that was so cool to see, how they related to each other, how they figured out who was going to run the training session. There were times where I made intentional mistakes in that session to kind of botch it a little bit to see if they would get on me. How would they address me? And there was a couple mistakes that I did a few times, recurring mistakes, just to see if someone had the courage to say, what do you gotta fix this, you gotta change this. And how would they say that? Would they yell at me? Would they tell me? So little things like that I think that's where you try to break down the boundaries between players within a team. You try to make them feel like more of a team, that they're actually all pulling together in the same direction. My take on, I've always coached teams with goalkeepers that can play in the field. I am a big believer in that. And I play my goalkeepers in the field and I switch them at half, and so I would, some people are completely dead set against that. So I don't want to, hopefully there's no goalkeeper zealots out there that are going to attack me for that. But I was the type of person that said, look, first half I'm going to play this keeper, second half I'm going to play this keeper, even in the biggest game. And last year we were in with our 03 girls at Pittsburgh. We were in the ECNL finals in California, and I did it. I swapped out my keepers at half, and thank God, but the one that went in the second half stood on her head and made an unbelievable save, and the one that went in on the field scored the goal that won the game. It was like one of those things where it's a storybook for me in that case. But as I said to the team, that was every game. That wasn't like a special case situation for that final. That was the culture of the team, that if I didn't change that at halftime, what message would that have sent to the other keeper? She would have been shattered. At that point, she would have said, like, I guess he doesn't trust me like I thought he did. And so that trust to me means something.
Yeah, amen. That's a cracking story. It's a great way to round out the culture that you can create through going through this process. So not sure everybody will be as fortunate to win ECNL national finals, but it is, like you say, a fairy tale ending to obviously something that was years in the making. So
and we lost many other games, through that process. Trust me, before we got to that point, we lost many other games that And I just said to the players and to the parents as well, it's on me. You know what I mean? Like, what am I going to say? This is what we're going to continue doing, and that's that.
Right. No, Jace, it's great, and it's a very nice kind of story and model to finish this with. What I would say to the people on the line is, obviously we've taken just over an hour of Jason's time, and I'm very, very conscious of that. The conversations don't seem to get any slower. They just fly. If there's anything that people have got left unanswered that's kind of come up, please feel free just to jump in the chat function kind of right now, because if not, I will call it there and thank Jason for obviously his time and his insight. So don't be shy. We do obviously encourage and appreciate questions if they do come through. But if not, Jace, like I said, from myself and Willow and all of Team Beyond Pulse and the people listening now and the people listening on demand once it goes out later, thank you. Fascinating ideas, fascinating insight. Really appreciate. Again, I've got scribbles of different books and different places where people can go, and I just love the phrases. I think it's becoming so apparent as we speak to so many great coaches, phrases that they use, so it's understandable to the players and relatable. And this was a great conversation. So thank you ever so much for it.
Yeah, thank you guys, appreciate it. I'll say the one other book that I didn't mention earlier that I should, because 2 books have been really influential. The one I mentioned was Good to Great by Jim Collins. The other one is called Extreme Ownership, and it's from Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, 2 Navy SEALs. And a family member of ours was killed in action that served with those guys, and that was a big reason I picked up that book to begin with. But life-changing book for me for sure.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sure we'll get those out and we'll direct people there. Absolutely. So, Jace, again, thank you for everything, and people on the line now and later. We have David Copeland Smith joining us tomorrow from Beast Mode Soccer. So, a blend of our coach and player series, looking at the importance of individual training, especially apt at the time that we're going through right now. So, we look forward to having you with us, and thank you again for choosing Beyond Pulse as your source of afternoon education.